pitch, the acrid tang of ozone and pulverized brick clawed at Sergeant Miller's throat. He pressed himself tighter against the damp stone of what had been yesterday a perfectly ordinary garden wall in Surrey. Now it was just another pocket barrier in the endless gray theater of war. The distant, rhythmic thud of artillery, always precisely timed, always from the same direction, vibrated through the ground beneath him. Footsteps, too neat, too synchronized. The distinctive, clipped cadence of the enemy patrol. Miller peered through a gap in the rubble, 3 of them moving with an unnerving uniformity down the ruined street. Their uniforms were immaculate, despite the surrounding devastation, their rifles held at an identical angle. Japanese. Here again, it had been months of this. Months since the impossible landings, the swift, brutal advance inland. Months of fighting house to house, street to street, in towns and villages that felt both achingly familiar and utterly alien under the constant threat of bombardment and the silent, efficient enemy. But it wasn't just the enemy's presence that, nor did Miller, it was the sameness. The patrols always took the same routes. The shelling always started at 0600 and stopped at 2200. The faces of the enemy soldiers, when you got close enough, were eerily similar, almost interchangeable, young, impassive, with a strange, almost waxy quality to their skin. And the damage, the damage felt wrong. Too clean in places, too uniform in its destruction in others. Like a stage set meticulously designed for maximum impact, a shard of glass glinted near his hand. He picked it up, turning it over. It was from a shop window, perhaps, but the edge was too smooth, too perfect, lacking the jagged randomness of a true break. He dropped it as the patrol drew closer. He raised his rifle, sighting on the lead figure. His finger tightened on the trigger. He'd done this 100 times, killed these men, watched them fall. But lately, the falling felt ... less final. Sometimes, in the periphery of his vision, he thought he saw them flicker, or their forms momentarily blur before solidifying again. He never mentioned it, not to Captain Davies, who just looked at him with weary, empty eyes. Not to the new recruits, whose terror was still fresh and genuine. The patrol was directly in front of him now. He squeezed the trigger. The first soldier crumpled, a silent heap. The other 2 didn't scatter, didn't dive for cover with the frantic instinct of men under fire. They simply pivoted, their movements fluid but mechanical, raising their own rifles. Miller rolled, firing again. Another fell. The last one stood, aiming directly at his position. Miller fired a 3rd time. The soldier dropped. Silence descended, again, broken only by the distant rhythmic shelling and the faint, persistent hum that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Miller waited, listening. No shouts, no calls for aid, just the silence and the hum. He crawled out from behind the wall, moving towards the fallen figures. He reached the first one, turning the body over with his boot. The face was young, unblemished, save for a thin line of dust. He knelt, reaching for the dog tag's standard procedure. His fingers brushed against the uniform collar. Beneath the fabric, where bone and muscle should have been, he felt something hard, smooth, and unnervingly cold, and the hum was stronger here, a low, almost imperceptible vibration against his fingertips. He pulled back the collar slightly, not skin, not flesh. A seamless, gray material stretched taut over something rigid beneath, like plastic, but warmer. Somehow, he pressed harder. It didn't yield like a human body. It felt ... manufactured ... A wave of nausea washed over him, colder than the material under his hand. This wasn't war, not real war. The thought solidified, chilling him to the bone. The sameness, the perfect movements, the waxy faces, the impossible landings, the staged destruction, the rhythmic shelling, the hum, it all clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. He looked up at the gray sky, the perpetual haze that obscured the sun. He looked at the ruined street, the perfectly broken glass, the wall that was too smooth. He looked at the fallen figure. At his feet, the seamless material beneath the uniform. They weren't fighting an enemy. They were in something. And the dark secret wasn't why Japan was here, fighting in the UK. It was what the UK was, and who, or what, they were truly fighting against. Or perhaps not fighting at all, but performing. for an audience he couldn't see, beyond the edges of this meticulously constructed reality. The hum seemed to grow louder, filling the air with a silent, terrifying promise of the truth. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a physical presence, a vibration deep in the bone, a pressure behind the eyes that made the world feel thin, stretched taut over something vast and unknowable. The air, previously thick with the scent of damp, earth, and distant smoke, now carried a sterile, almost metallic tangs, like static electricity or ozone just before a storm. Looking out at the ruined landscape, the protagonist saw it with new, terrifying clarity. The rubble piles seemed to artfully arranged, the scorch marks on buildings to precisely delineated. A sudden gust of wind didn't scatter dust naturally. It seemed to lift it in predetermined swirls, revealing patches of ground that looked suspiciously like freshly laid. Asphalt beneath a thin veneer of debris, he moved through the uncanny quiet. The hum guiding him, or perhaps hurting him, he found a building half collapsed that felt different, not just damaged, but wrong. The stone blocks were too uniform, the mortar lines too perfect, despite the gaping hole in its side. Inside, the air was colder, dead. There was no smell of decay, no lingering human scent, only that sterile temps and the omnipresent hum. Now resonating within the very walls, in what might have been a study. Untouched by the apparent destruction outside, he found a desk. On it lay a single, bound ledger. Not a military report, nor a personal diary, but something else entirely. The script was elegant, precise, detailing not troop movements or casualties, but sequence adjustments, prop inventory, and audience response projections. One entry, dated just weeks prior, chilled him to the core. Act 3, Scene 4 requires heightened tension. Recommend increasing civilian distress parameters. And introducing unexpected resistance variable Japanese forces to maintain narrative arc. Ensure hum resonance remains within acceptable subliminal dread range. Monitor Subject 7's trajectory deviation from script detected. Subject 7, was that him? The thought sent a jolt of pure, icy fear through him. He flipped pages frantically, finding diagrams that looked like architectural blueprints but were labeled stage layouts and environmental controls. There were notes on whether simulation integrity and emotional resonance fields. The war wasn't a conflict. It was a meticulously scripted drama, a grand, horrific play performed on a vast stage. But for whom? And why? He heard a sound then, distinct from the hum. A faint rhythmic clicking from deeper within the building. It wasn't footsteps. It sounded mechanical, precise. He crept towards it, the ledger clutched in his hand. The clicking led him to a room that should have been a cellar, but was a sterile metallic chamber. In the center stood a device, humming with a low, resonant frequency that matched the one outside. It was complex, covered in dials and blinking lights, utterly alien in its design. And attached to it, like wires feeding into a monstrous heart, were thick cables that snaked out through conduits in the walls, presumably connecting to the stage outside. As he watched, one of the lights on the device flickered, and the hum outside seemed to momentarily stutter, like a faulty projector. For an instant, the illusion wavered. The perfect rubble outside seemed to shimmer, and the air felt thin enough to see through it, catching a glimpse of something vast, dark, and utterly indifferent beyond. Then the light steadied, the hum returned, and the world snapped back into its constructed reality, the brief glimpse of the void leaving him breathless and trembling. The clicking continued. It was coming from a small, almost hidden panel on the device. He opened it, revealing a series of spools, turning slowly. Magnetic tape, it looked ancient, yet the machine felt cutting edge. He pulled a section of the tape free. It wasn't audio. It was covered in tiny, intricate symbols, patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as he looked at them. A language, instructions. Or perhaps the very code of this manufactured reality, the script being fed into the world. By agonizing moment, he heard movement, then closer this time, not the rhythmic clicking, but a soft, deliberate tread. Someone else was here, someone who might be part of the performance, or perhaps one of the stagehands. He slipped the section of tape into his pocket, the ledger under his arm, and melted. Back into the shadows, the hum now feeling less like a promise of truth and more like the watchful gaze of an unseen director, aware that one of the actors had gone off script. The war wasn't the secret. The secret was that there was no war, only a theater of cruelty, and he was trapped on its stage. The audience waiting somewhere in the dark, just beyond the edge of the world. The hum intensified, a low thrum against his teeth, no longer a distant whisper, but a presence pressing in from all sides. It was the sound of the director clearing their throat, of the stage lights focusing, even in the oppressive gloom. He was off script, a rogue element in a meticulously choreographed performance, and the unseen gaze felt like a physical weight. Pinning him to the shadows, he moved deeper into the skeletal remains of the city. Each shattered building now a carefully constructed flat, each pile of rubble a deliberate obstacle. The air, thick with the scent of dust and decay, felt less like the aftermath of bombardment and more like stale stage smoke. He passed a corpse slumped against a wall, the pose too dramatic, the blood stain on the tattered uniform a shade too vibrant, like cheap paint. He resisted the urge to poke it, to see if the body was solid or just canvas stretched over a frame. Further on, he saw a patrol of enemy soldiers silhouetted against a flickering fire. They moved with an unnatural synchronicity, their steps too precise, their weapon handling too fluid, like dancers rehearsing a routine. There was no tension in their posture, none of the jittery fear or grim determination of men in a war zone. They were performers hitting their marks. The chilling realization settled. The enemy wasn't just playing a role. They were the role, perhaps as trapped as he was, or perhaps simply unaware. Automatons following cues he couldn't hear. He ducked into what remained of a shop. The sign above the door hanging precariously, its faded lettering advertising finest silks. Inside, amidst the splintered wood and plaster dust, he found something that made his blood run cold. Tucked beneath a collapsed counter was a small metallic object. It was smooth, cold, and utterly alien to the historical period this war purported to be set in. It looked like a miniature, intricate camera lens, or perhaps a sensor, embedded in a piece of polished dark stone. It pulsed faintly with a light too subtle for the eye, a tiny beat echoing the omnipresent hum. He pocketed it, the object feeling impossibly heavy, a tangible piece of the machinery behind the illusion. Emerging back into the street, he almost collided with another soldier from his own unit, Private Miller. Miller's face was streaked with grime, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Sir, thank God," Miller gasped, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. "It's worse than they said. The front line. It just shifted, like the ground moved, and the sounds, not fighting, like cheering, distant but clear. And the captain, he's just sitting there, staring at his hands, muttering about blocking and cues." Miller's account was a jumble of fear and confusion, but it wasn't the typical battlefield panic, shifted, cheering, blocking and cues. It wasn't just him seeing it. But Miller's eyes held a frantic, uncomprehending terror, not the dawning, horrifying clarity he himself felt. Was Miller another actor whose script had frayed, or was he genuinely experiencing the glitches, without understanding the nature of the show? "Where's the captain now?" he asked, keeping his voice low, the hum seeming to vibrate in response to his words. "Back there," Miller gestured vaguely behind him, towards a section of ruins that hadn't been there moments ago, or had been in a different configuration. "But don't go. It feels wrong, like the air is thicker, and the hum." Miller trailed off, shivering. He looked at Miller, then back at the impossible ruins. The front line hadn't shifted. The set had been rearranged. The cheering was the audience, closer now. The captain wasn't breaking down from combat stress. He was struggling with his lines. He had a choice: try to guide the terrified Miller, potentially drawing more attention from the director, or leave him to his fate, a minor character whose scene was ending. The hum pulsed, a silent ultimatum. He made his decision, a cold knot tightening in his gut. "Stay here, Miller," he ordered, his voice flat. "Keep low, I'll find the captain." He didn't wait for a response, turning and moving towards the newly appeared ruins, the metallic object in his pocket a cold weight, the hum a suffocating blanket. He was no longer just off-script, he was actively exploring the backstage, and the director's patience, he suspected, was wearing thin. The theater of cruelty was vast and complex, and he had only just begun to understand the terrifying scale of its production, and somewhere, just beyond the edge of his perception, the audience waited, their unseen eyes fixed upon the stage. Eager for the next act, he pushed further into the archives of the forgotten, the places where history frayed at the edges and the official script grew thin. This wasn't the grand library or the state repository. It was the musty back rooms of defunct societies, the damp cellars beneath crumbling manors, the private collections of eccentrics who hoarded not wealth but the detritus of time. Here, the air was thick with the dust of centuries, and the silence hummed with untold stories. His search, initially focused on a specific historical anomaly, had metastasized into a hunt for the very architecture of the theater. He wasn't just looking for evidence of manipulation. He was looking for the blueprints, the stage directions, the casting calls. In a forgotten desk, tucked away in a secret compartment behind a false panel, he found it. Not a blueprint, but something far more unsettling. A ledger, bound in cracked leather, its pages brittle and yellowed. It wasn't a financial record or a personal diary. It was a chillingly clinical account of historical events, but described in the language of the stage. Entries detailed Scene 3, Act 4, The Great Betrayal, listing key players' names that echoed through history as villains and victims and required props, instruments of torture, poisoned chalices, forged documents. Another entry, Rehearsal Notes for Act 2, Scene 5, The Famine, spoke of managing audience expectation, optimizing despair, and adjusting the timing of key deaths for maximum dramatic impact. There were notes on understudies for major roles and chillingly audience response projections for specific acts of cruelty. The ledger was a horrifying confirmation of his darkest suspicions, yet it introduced a new layer of terror. This wasn't just a metaphor. Someone, somewhere, had documented the suffering of millions as if it were a meticulously planned performance. But who wrote it? The handwriting was precise, almost calligraphic, offering no clue to identity. Was this the director's personal notes, or the record of a stage manager? Seeking context, he tracked down an old reclusive scholar known for his unorthodox theories about historical causality. The man lived amidst towering piles of books, dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light that pierced the gloom. He spoke in riddles, his eyes darting nervously. "Ah, the theater," the scholar rasped, a dry cough rattling his chest. "Many believe there is but one director, a singular will shaping the ages. But I have found evidence of competing scripts, of scenes cut and reinserted, of actors improvising wildly, sometimes to the director's displeasure, sometimes to the audience's delight." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and the audience, they are not passive observers. Oh no, they have their favorites, their demands. Sometimes, I suspect, the director is merely playing to the house. This contradicted the ledger's implication of a single controlling vision. Was the theater a chaotic, multi-authored production, or was the ledger merely one perspective, perhaps even a deliberate misdirection? The scholar's words added layers of complexity and doubt, suggesting the forces at play were even more intricate and less predictable than he had imagined. As he delved deeper, the director's impatience became palpable. Access to certain archives was suddenly revoked. Key contacts became unreachable or offered vague, unsettling warnings. He felt a subtle pressure, a tightening net. A loose floorboard creaked in his empty room at night. A shadow lingered a moment too long at the end of an alley. These weren't overt threats, not yet, but the subtle adjustments of the stage, guiding him back towards the designated path, or perhaps towards a different, more dangerous scene entirely. He held the ledger, its theatrical language, a grotesque parody of human suffering. And the scholar's words echoed in his mind, competing scripts, demanding audience, a director who might be a puppet as much as a puppeteer. The backstage was vast, labyrinthine, filled with conflicting cues and hidden traps. And out there, in the darkness beyond the footlights, the unseen eyes of the audience remained fixed, waiting for the next act to unfold. Their expectations, a silent, terrifying pressure, the mystery had not clarified. It had merely expanded, revealing new, unsettling dimensions to the terrible performance he found himself trapped within. The archives are now sealed. The full truth may never be known, leaving only whispers and shadows in the pages of history. Some stories are best left buried.